Discussion goes on now with two new introductions. First, we will have John O'Hagan, Professor of Economics, talk to us, and then we'll have the fourth speaker today, Gwyney. And then we'll resume the debate, and we'll have all the four panelists up here, and we'll have till 5 o'clock. So, John, please.
Thanks, Paul. I'm used to lecturing for this podium, but it's to a student audience, and I realised sitting through the first session that I'm really a misfit here. I'm not in the practitioner arts, but I can't change the presentation now, so I'm going to run with what I have. And it's a little bit, it is academic-y, but I tried to make it more general. But I want to thank the Long Room Hub for the invitation, and in particular I want to congratulate the Long Room Hub for organising the Trinity Week events. And I wasn't sure whether you were running the Trinity Ball or not, and then I saw Grania's slide. It looked like a Trinity Ball slide for a while. But apart from Trinity Ball, the Long Room Hub have really organised a great set of events. I already had one slight joke, and it's been ruined by Martin. Lou's not been able to come, but I was going to make it anyway, even though he's not here. That I had to watch him on the news for 10 years, for 25 minutes almost every day. And it was going to give me great pleasure that he had to listen to me for once. But anyway, I didn't get that opportunity. The other speakers are practitioners, as I've just said, and doers and optimists. And I'm really coming from an academic background. And I think you all, I'm an economist as well, and I think you'd all be disappointed if economists weren't killjoys. So I am going to put a little bit of doubt on some of the arguments. Two or three people are here. I presented a very similar paper last year. We had an academic forum on Scotland and Ireland and culture and identity. So the paper is quite similar. So I apologise to the people who were there. Last year I did it by video, so the only difference this year is it's live and slightly different. I want to thank Joanna Archibald, who prepared the graphics for this here. And she was the author of the report that was referred to last Tuesday, Creativity, the City and the University. The question came up, I will be talking about the arts largely, not culture. Culture is too broad a term. Even arts is hard to define. But, and what you'd see in the discussion is the dichotomy or tension between commercial arts and state arts. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, but it really is art. I agree with some of the speakers, culture is an extraordinarily wide term and should be. So with that, I'm going to go over quite a few slides here. This is a picture of one of our cultural institutions, National Library, and it wasn't taken this week or last week, as you can see. But the intention of Joanna's report was to bring the city, the picture from the city looking into the cultural institution. And the idea behind that report is the culture and the city could merge more. And so that's a nice choice of image. So I've tried to link the topic to leadership, and maybe I'm distorting it a little bit. But you might be surprised, for an economist, I'm going to de-emphasize the economic impact. Because I believe if you put the emphasis on the economics of the arts, it's finished. Every activity has economic spin-offs, be it hairdressing or whatever. But that's not unique about arts. But it is a reality with the arts, that it's an extra that shouldn't be forgotten. So really what I want to talk about are other leadership benefits, not in the economic sense, and that might surprise you. But economics is not nearly as narrow a science as people make out. We define wealth in a much broader terms than simply the financial. So I'm going to bring you through what I think the arts must play a leading role, and did, and must continue to, in national identity and social cohesion. I think that function must remain central to the arts. I'm going to talk about national prestige, and I'm going to talk about the dichotomy then between the commercial arts and the state arts sector. Contribution to innovation in different ways. Again, this week is not. So the last one here, the economic spillover, is really what some of the discussion earlier on has been about de-emphasise that, but yet to recognise it. And then I want to just talk, since following from the report on Tuesday, that I'm going to look at the state art sector and talk about just give you a sample of leadership issues that are involved in that sector. And then I suppose the meat of the paper is going to be the concluding comments, where I will try and question some of the critique with them. So just let me take the first benefit. And I think the arts must play a leadership role in national identity, and national identity, the importance of that in turn is generating social cohesion. So this is your standard argument. You hear it not just in economics but outside economics, that the arts contribute to national identity, particularly through our museums, but literature, drama and so on. And that is almost an indisputable argument that's used in favour of the arts. But, as I said last year by video, the concept of national identity may have some meaning in a small community like Ireland. But the concept of national identity is criticised by many people. And if you're talking about this aspect of the arts, you should be aware of that. Many people are highly sceptical of the notion of national identity. So that's the first point I want to make here, but that doesn't mean I'm dismissing that. The other very important point is many other things contribute to the national identity as much as arts. So sports, the media, religion, language, etc., all contribute to national identity, and not just the arts. And some people in the arts feel they're the only contributor to this. So let me come back, though. I do think there is a case for national identity, or in the sense that it creates social cohesion. I mean, one of our main reasons for primary and secondary education is to have a socially cohesive society. Because unless you have a socially cohesive society, the market can't operate, and you'll have no economy as well. So I think that is the importance of national identity is this contribution to social cohesion. And this is a quote of somebody who worked in the Smithsonian, and he's dead now, but anybody from the museum sector will know this. But it's a quote I saw many years ago, but it's still a quote that resonates with me, that the arts are one of the principal means by which people communicate with each other, transmit beliefs, and then from one generation to another and between. And that is what social cohesion is about. And you may question later, is social cohesion necessary for a functioning society? I would argue it is, and that the arts probably is a key lead role to play in that. I then repeat this point again, though, that this social glue role of the arts can be played by other aspects. So the mass media, and again, religion and sport. So you have to ask what's different about the arts. Because if you look at the newspapers, and especially in sport, on certain national occasions, it has a similar function in creating social cohesion. I think the argument could be made, though, that the art sector maybe has a big long-term role. Football matches are won and lost, and the social cohesion maybe for a couple of days, and social incohesion if we lose the matches. So you could argue that the arts is different and maybe has a longer-term lead role in social cohesion. So that's the first of the leadership benefits of the arts, and I think it shouldn't be forgotten in the milieu of the discussion of the economic benefits. The next argument is that it contributes to national prestige and national standing. And again, people question this, and which I will in a certain sense. I think the first point to make is it's badly needed in the present climate. So everybody is talking about the smart economy and culture, maybe it'll revive fortunes in the Irish economy. That's understandable. We certainly need national prestige to be raised, and maybe the arts has a role. And, sorry, I need two different glasses, so I'll read this here. So this is Baumol, is an American economist who wrote in the 1960s really about when the arts were neglected in the US. But a lot of his argument was about national prestige. The US is seen as a wasteland in terms of culture and the arts. And this was before the formation of the National Endowment for the Arts. And he talked about the billions of dollars that the US were spending on getting people to the moon, whereas the prestige attached to the vibrant arts sector internationally was much more important. And there's little doubt that there's countries that attach significance to having success in the arts. Just like many private individuals spend fortunes supporting the arts when they make their fortunes. countries have the same desire, and nations, to be associated with art because it brings prestige. Now, whether prestige is a good thing or not, I'm not really debating. The only point I make here, though, is that prestige does apply to achievements in sport. So when an Irish runner does very well, or an Irish football team, there is prestige associated with that. So it's not just sport, but it's films, the IT sector, or the beer industry. So when you go away to Japan, or somebody knows Guinness, and Guinness from Dublin, you feel, oh my God, that's great, I even know Ireland. And again, it makes you feel good, or some people feel good, and the arts definitely has a role to play. So what's different about the arts then? And why has it to play a lead role? And one point I would make is that the arts, or part of the arts, are distinctively Irish. And distinctive Irishness is often the key to national success and prestige. There is success in things that are non-distinctively Irish, but you heard Ed earlier talking about what films succeed, because they're distinctively Irish. And you could argue in that sense that the arts are unique in bringing out Irishness, and it links back to our national identity. But the point I want to make is the arts must embrace, many people think of the arts as the state sector. The arts must include the state and the commercial sector. And a lot of the prestige is often associated with the commercial arts sector. So I'll come back to this in the conclusion, that you have these two sectors, and in some ways there's a division between them. And I know groups of people who only think of the arts as the state art sector, the national museums and the fine arts, rather than the commercial. So I'm just posing this question. If May Vinci does very well, or Joyce, is there any difference in terms of national prestige? What about Boyzone or the Dubliners? What about Riverdance or Philadelphia, Here I Come? Or if we win an Oscar or a Nobel Prize? They all bring similar national prestige. But yet some people I know would frown at some of these being listed. But I'll come back to this point again. I really think you must embrace the arts is the commercial arts and the state arts. And I just posed that question. The next one is in relation to innovation. And we've heard about this already, that the arts have an extremely important role in innovation. I know somebody asked what we mean by creativity, and you could ask the same question about what is innovation. I can certainly, it's a bit like trying to define an elephant. You know when there's innovation involved, and you know when there's definitely no innovation involved, but I still wouldn't try to define it. But it's a valid question. But I just want to talk about different aspects. The first one is always been the role of the arts, and has been already referred to. The arts always had a role in challenging society, and that's one of the most important functions, as well as actually it's almost the opposite to the one I've talked about, building up social cohesion. So the role of the arts was to establish, has always been to establish authority and ideas. And as I've said here, this is the traditional social innovation role of the arts, which has always been important. And it's not just the state arts I'm talking about, it's the commercial arts as well. But that can be extended, and what has really been recognised more recently is that there's also an innovation role in relation to the commercial sector and general economic activity that's increasingly recognised. So, for example, there's benefits for commercial TV, film industry from the state sector. There's benefits in industrial design. You heard Paul talking about this earlier, in the software industry, the ICT sector, part of the retail sector, and so on. I remember reading once that the success of BMWs is not their engineering, but it's the design team. And that's the spin-off, and they're getting a spin-off from the state arts sector into commercial design. And it's this innovation. And if you talk to people in commercial sectors, not just commercial arts sectors, they will all tell you the same thing. I remember meeting Cameron McIntosh, who runs all the West End shows, and asked him, was he in favour of subsidies to the state arts sector? We were looking at the English theatre sector, and he was wholly supportive of subsidies. And I'm going to come, I don't know whether this point, yeah, in the next slide. So what the point he was making was that this applies to the performing arts as well. So the concert hall and the theatre are the laboratory, which we have in sciences, for composers and playwrights. They must be there, and no experimental work will take, no new writing will take place. There's also they're also a testing ground, as I've said here, for new performing talent. And this is the point that Cameron McIntosh made. He said all of their new plays come from the state sector. That their sector would dry up unless they had talent tested in the state sector. and they would dry up unless they knew plays. And maybe only 1 in 20 plays ever is commercial success, but you need a test play, just like in academic research. 19 out of 20 of your experiments don't work, and likewise in the arts. So I think this is an important, and it's a very important lead role for the, and especially as the economy becomes more advanced, increasingly this role of the arts will be important. In a broad sense, design, as Paul said, the Swedish example was just perfect about that need. And you know, the stock response of economists is, well, you have copyright and patents, but I won't go into the reasons. That's simply not enough. Very often you need direct subsidies, just like you do for university research, and or direct provision, as you do have in some of the sectors. So that's the third leadership candidate. So I'm finally coming to the one that I suppose you all thought I was going to be talking about first, and that's economic spillover. So the argument here is state monies are going to employment. We spend lots of money through the IDA and Enterprise Ireland on employment. Why not in the arts as well? And the second point I'm making there is direct employment is not special. You'll never make a case for the arts on the basis of direct employment, because every activity creates employment. So whether you have people out, as I said, hairdressers, retailers, every economic activity involves employment. There's nothing special. There's no reason why the state should be involved, because there's employment. But, and I think that's really important to remember. The first really different argument, though, is that the arts could be a magnet for other economic activities. So it's, in a sense, a loss leader. If you draw in people, then there's benefits for the rest of the economy. And you've heard about this already in relation to Temple Bar. So in the Irish case, you're talking about heritage sites. You may be talking about the Abbey Theatre. You're talking about festivals, the Long Room, which is huge visiting audience, or lots of people coming for genealogy. So the argument here is that the arts is the lead attraction. And once you have this lead attraction, bringing people into Ireland, then the spin-off for other sectors. Another part of this argument is Richard Florida, who's become very popular. He says not only if you've got creative people in a city, you look right across the United States, other people are attracted into that city because of creative people. So even business leaders come into a city because they want to be able to attend the arts, and they want to be able to hire the type of designers we were talking about earlier. Now, I'll come back and question all of this later. I'm kind of setting up the case for the arts at the moment. The first qualification is, you know, well, what's special? Even if we say it is the lead sector in attracting people to Ireland. But the immediate response, but so do sports facilities. So lots of people come to Ireland for golf. Lots of people come for fishing, for national parks, or because of very good pubs and restaurants. And nobody is saying we should subsidise those or give them direct grants. So you have to remember what is different about the arts from these other activities that are attracting people into Ireland. And it's not just the state. I listed the earlier ones were all state arts, the heritage sites, the genealogy, the archives. But it's not just those, I mean the commercial arts as well, and again people balk at this. So the rock concerts attract huge numbers of people into Ireland. And maybe some of you might shudder and think, oh, well, that's not really what I meant by arts. But I'll come back to this later. Festivals, and I'm not talking about opera festivals like Wexford. I'm talking about the Rose of Tralee, Mary of... Yes. The Guinness Hop Stores. The Guinness Hop Stores is the biggest paying tourist attraction in the country. So again, when you get down this route, you've got to think of this. There's other non-arts activities that attract people here, and there's also commercial arts activities that you may not consider to be arts. I think that's to bear that in mind. So again, what is this different about the arts sector that we could make a case? Well, I agree that the arts, you can see this slide behind you. I mean, you can play golf anywhere in the world. Or you can go to a rock concert anywhere in the world. Or you can watch a film anywhere in the world. But you're not going to see Tom McNoy's or the Rock of Cashel or live Irish drama performed in the Abbey anywhere else in the world. So you could argue that, yes, these are other activities that are very important, but the arts are unique and therefore have an important lead role in this activity. Then the last point to make is, if this is true, then you could make even an economic argument that the state should be involved, because if there's spillovers for the rest of the economy, not just, I started out by saying the direct employment doesn't matter. It's the spillovers for the rest of the economy. If they exist, then you have a fourth, very powerful argument for a lead role in the arts in social and economic revival. So I've just got one asset here. I'm just going to talk about the state arts sector and how there's leadership issues involved here, because I try to establish the state arts sector is going to remain very important, as well as the commercial arts sector. But this is from the report that Joanna had on Tuesday. So libraries and archives. Archives are now attracting large numbers of people to Ireland, either virtually or directly into the country. And we really need leadership there, because we need to continue to share. These are extremely costly collections, and especially with digitization. So that's a very important area of leadership that we need. Shared services. These cost money, and the best value out of these. Just going to give you another. We need innovative. I don't want to get involved in the pay talks involved at the moment, but we do need innovation in relation to staff moving between different parts of the state sector, especially professional staff, and again, given the cost of that. And that's going to lead to a better cultural output from our archives and our libraries and our museums. We need much more outreach, engaging the community. So, I mean, I know Ronnie got some criticism this morning, but earlier this afternoon. But I mean, the state sector must get involved in this outreach, and in some respects, Temple Garden does a very good job. But we need the state sector also engaging in outreach. And, they don't have the same commercial constraints. So what I'm talking about here is, as I said already, the arts are important in building identity and social cohesion. So culture nights are important, but all the national institutions must get involved in it. We also need educational programs. We need much better signage. We heard already there is actually no culture map or arts map for Dublin. We also need, I've said already, the tourism isn't the raison d'etre, it's only the fourth benefit, but it is a benefit of the arts. And it has resonance in the Department of Finance, because actually it's not costing money all the time. But the state sector must get involved in exploiting tourism. The Kelvin Museum in Glasgow, we had a speaker over last year. I mean, it's a court person. It's fantastic the way he's turned around attendance at the Kelvin Museum. And then the Smithsonian in Washington, which is is not the biggest museum in the world, they happen to combine scholarship and making it extremely attractive. And there's no conflict, in my opinion, between scholarship and actually trying to engage young people in the museums in the Smithsonian. And then finally, I think there needs to be coming together of the commercial and non-commercial sectors. There's synergies between these sectors, and it always hurts me, not hurts me, but upsets me, the high art, low art dichotomy. Because some of the most popular arts in this country don't qualify for some people as the high arts, and I'll come back to that in the concluding. So I just want to make a couple of points, really. They're not very well developed, but it's thought. I think the distinction between the state and commercial sectors is important, but as I've already said, whilst that distinction is important in terms of role in the state, there must be a coming together. If we're looking at employment in the sector, which I'm afraid I'm very sceptical about, but the vast bulk of the employment in the commercial sector. It's not in the state sector. So actors and artists and people working in museums are a tiny proportion of total employment. That is never the reason for these sectors existing or being subsidised. So I warned about that earlier. In relation to the commercial sector, we're simply talking about the state facilitating development in that sector, never getting involved in the provision. In relation to the state sector, which the biggest sector are libraries and museums, we're talking about direct state provision. And, but again, is to have that distinction when we're talking about the two sectors. The next point I make here is we have significant public funding in relation to the arts. For some of you, it's not enough. And you know, if you just like academics do, you compare yourself to Germany if you're trying to say we don't have enough, and if you say we have too much, you compare yourself to the US. But there is significant public funding. I think it's important that the value from that is maximised in terms of the benefits I discussed earlier. I was slightly worried when somebody asked what do we mean by creativity earlier on. But I think even though we can't define it in a clear sense, I think that there's a recognition of the role of creativity in employment and innovation policy, and that was very much recognised in the document that Gráinne talked about earlier, the task force report. And here come the qualifications. These concepts are not new, so when I hear about Florida, I slightly get upset. Marshall was an economist in the 1890s. He wrote about clusters and creative cities. He wrote about creative cities not in 1890, in the 13th century in Italy, and the clustering of activity. So these are not new concepts. And so what bothers me is people think that Florida, this is a whole new concept. I still don't think anybody has developed on Marshall writing in 1890. So I think just to bear that in mind. The other thing to bear in mind is cities of culture are there for decades, and everybody, I'd say there must be 100, 200 cities that want to be a creative city. There's nothing wrong with that, but once you realise it's not a new concept, and with this study with Joanna, I mean, every second city in the US wants to be a creative city. And again, this will come to a point I'm going to mention later. The next point I want to make is link back to Marshall. There's lots of economists who are extremely sceptical of the Florida hypothesis. It's based on flimsy evidence that creative people do attract people into the city. But, you know, like in anything, sometimes it's an act of faith. It's very hard to prove anything or to disprove anything with figures. But just again to warn the audience that there is a lot of doubt about that sort of argument. And of course, there's many people who disagree with any intervention in the state sector, especially in the United States. So originally I didn't have Tyler in brackets here in case anybody was confused about who I was referring to here. Tyler Cowen is a US economist who has written about, and provocatively, I think he almost likes being provocative, but he argues that the free market, you shouldn't get involved at all in the arts sector. And like all of these arguments, it's very polemical and he's trying to get you to think, but he has wonderful examples of composers and artists only getting up out of bed to work when there's a bag of gold held in front of them. So his main thesis really is that the market and private patronage is what drive artists to work, not public subsidy and being allowed to do whatever you want. But he has taken selective. I remember I argued with him. I went and gave him the example of Finland, where there's very creative work happening in the music sector, classical music sector, because of large state subsidies. But still, you should be aware there's a very strong feeling against supporting the arts, and the National Endowment of the Arts has been greatly scaled back in the US. So is the cultural sector the new IT sector, or IFSC? Because that's really what people are talking about. The IFSC was a huge success, so the smart economy with culture at the centre may be the way forward. And you'd be disappointed about it, as an economist I said earlier, didn't cast doubt over that. Possibly. I don't know. But what the conference today is bringing out, you certainly need dynamic leadership. I think you need and innovation. But you need less state dependency. The commercial sector should be able to drive itself. So there should be less state dependency culture, especially in the current economic climate. And the other thing you must recognise, as I've said, hundreds of cities are being labelling themselves creative cities. Ireland has to be unique. We're just a tiny player in the world stage in the arts. So what we need to be able to do is identify in what sense. And this comes back to the arts earlier. It's the Irishness of some of the arts that might make us unique and stand out. Never forget, though, as I said earlier, that to me the primary functions of the arts sector, especially the state arts sector, is national identity, social cohesion, which is part of the education function in the country, and maybe for some people national prestige. So if all of this comes true, and the smart economy comes to being, and the culture has a role to play, I want to make the following prediction, which is just taken from Joanna's report and concluded her report. A nice quote from AE in this times of depression. So as I've said, maybe that's what's ahead, especially if the arts are at the centre. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for proving that economics is not always the dismal science. And now, Wayne, to give us the fourth inspiration. Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm sure all wilting, although John's presentation was very interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply that. Forgive me, John. I just have the possibly unenviable task of keeping you engaged towards the end of the afternoon. But it's interesting listening to John, because last year when McCarthy published his On Board Sniff New report, as some of you may know, the Irish Film Board was squarely in the firing line. And the proposal in that report was that the Irish Film Board be abolished, which for me and for my friends and colleagues working in the industry would have been an absolute disaster. I can't tell you what a disaster would have been. It would have probably meant that most of us left the country. But what was interesting about it is that it sort of galvanized us all to think about the film industry and its role in the economy and the country and the future of the country. And it's also very interesting because actually the first thing we did was we rushed to the employment argument. It was sort of, we thought, well, you know, we're being kind of criticized as an industry that doesn't contribute to the kind of national economy, and the most tangible thing you can do if you want to contribute to the national economy is provide employment. And we all ran to that argument and embraced it wholeheartedly and talked about it for quite a long time. And actually, I think we did, before we sort of went back to government with the arguments we had marshalled for the film industry, we realized that that was not the right thing to do. That actually, in a way, if the only reason we were justifying our existence was because of a kind of employment benefit, then we were very vulnerable indeed. But it's funny that in the times you kind of feel compelled to rush towards the kind of economic arguments, because in a way the sort of cultural, creative, other arguments, they're just a bit more airy-fairy and harder to kind of convince stony-hearted politicians and civil servants. But the other thing that was brilliant that happened last year, which was sort of came out of nowhere, of course, was when we were all kind of miserable at the prospect of having the film board discontinued and state and the tax incentives discontinued, etc. All of the brightest brains of the diaspora and our business community gathered together in Dublin Castle and started saying what a great thing the arts was and culture was, and we were like, great, it was brilliant, because actually it's sort of, I think that part of the reason that we actually managed to escape the cuts, and because in the past the film board had been abolished in the 80s in a similar time of recession, but suddenly because this argument was being embraced by, if you like, the great and the good, and so it was very fortuitous, I think. Anyway, that's really just a sort of a rambling observation. I was just going to talk a little bit about I suppose what I do. I suppose it's a little different to the way the others have spoken. I'm going to talk specifically about my experience as a film producer in Ireland. And I think it's interesting because some of the things that I'm reflecting on, again, have come up in what everyone else has talked about in kind of probably clearer and more concise terms. But I run a film company in Dublin, which is called Element Pictures. We employ about, well, we have a small office in London, an office in Dublin. We employ about 17 people full-time. About a third of them work in our distribution business. About 3 work in development, which is effectively R&D, and the rest are kind of support staff, finance, legal people, etc. We produce feature films, and we produce television drama, and we distribute feature films in Ireland. And some of the projects we've been involved in over the years include the Magdalene Sisters, Oma, The Wind That Shakes the Barley. All 3, of course, are films that deal with Ireland's kind of recent history and some of the icons of Irish culture, as I mentioned earlier on. But also we've been involved in films like Adam and Paul and Garage, which arguably talk about a different type of Ireland. And television shows like Pure Mule and Bachelor's Walk, which also arguably talk about a different kind of Ireland. So our business is absolutely a business based on making and exploiting a cultural product. And as film producers, our job is to take ideas and to turn them into commercial entities and to deliver them to the people who paid for them, whether it's a broadcaster or the audience via the cinemas or increasingly via video on demand, etc. And an example of that, if you like, is something like The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which is a film that we were very lucky to be involved in as co-producers. So we didn't originate the project, but because it was made in Ireland, we were attached to it as the Irish co-producers and were able to help access some money. But what's interesting about a film like The Wind That Shakes the Barley is that it's hard to define because it is a synthesis of the commercial, the economic, and the cultural or creative, or whatever particular label you want to put on that. But it is an absolute synthesis of those 3 things. It's a film, as you know, about many of you know at least, about the Civil War, which was written by a guy called Paul Laverty and directed by Ken Loach, who's one of the most famous and venerated British filmmakers around. It cost about €6 million. It was financed as an Irish, French, UK-German co-production, so there was money from those 4 countries in the financing of the film. It had about 12 different sources of finance, and those sorts of finance were a combination of state finance, so if you like the Irish Film Board or the UK Film Council and tax incentives in Ireland, and also hard commercial money. So it would have been German distributors advancing money because they believed they would make money in the box office, same with French distributors. So in a sense, in its financing, it was a concoction of, if you like, the state and the commercial. It was filmed in about 7 weeks in the south of Ireland, around Cork and Kerry. It was filmed, as with all Ken Loach movies, in sequence, which meant that we filmed it in script order, which creates its own kind of dynamic, because if you've seen the film, early on there's a scene that takes place in Killarney train station, and then later on in the film there's a scene that takes place in Killarney train station, so we had to keep the station dressed for 5 weeks in the middle. But my point about all of that is that we spent a lot of money in the area of Cork and Kerry in making that film. So an awful lot of what we raised was spent there. And then at the end of all of this, the film won arguably the second most prestigious film prize in the world, which is the Palme d'Or in Cannes, which is a kind of the main film festival in the world. So as a kind of creative or cultural entity, it told an Irish story to an audience right around the world. It won the Palme d'Or. As an economic entity, it employed well over 100 cast and crew directly, but also spent a lot of money in Cork and Kerry on hotels and local employment, and it also showcased, I suppose, that region of Ireland to an international audience, so it had a kind of a spin-off benefit in terms of tourism. As a commercial entity, it sold very well internationally because it was a successful film. It sold right around the world to distributors right around the world. It grossed over 30 million euros in cinemas around the world, and then would have done more business as a video or DVD and then on television. So it sort of embraces those 3 things, and it is one of the kind of the sort of challenges and attractions of what we do, is that we're always kind of walking that tightrope between the commercial and the creative. And I thought that it might be just worth drawing out some sort of thoughts, if you like, about how we run our business and how we sort of what we come across in running our business on a kind of day-to-day, which may or may not chime with, I suppose, let's call it traditional business, and also may or may not chime with other other entities that are involved in let's call it the creative industries or the arts. First of all, what we do has a really high attrition rate. In other words, we develop an awful lot of stuff that doesn't get made. And even of the stuff that does finally get made, an awful lot of it doesn't work. So it's sort of, there's a kind of, probably maybe 1 in 8 of the projects that we develop, if you like, in our, we don't call it R&D, but our R&D function gets made, and then maybe 1 in 4 of the things that get made are successful or not. So it's sort of, and how you define success is sort of probably another seminar, so I won't go into that, but commercially successful, if you like. Sometimes things are successful without being commercially successful because they play to an audience that is very much interested in that thing, and that's why you made the film in the first place, if you like. We not uniquely live in a very precarious world in that, the kind of the environment in terms of, government support of the industry, but also the kind of commercial environment is very, very difficult at the moment. And I suppose added to that, probably no more than many other industries, although it feels particularly sharp for us, we're in the change of a total revolution in how our business operates, which is driven by technological change. So for us right now, we are experiencing the same kind of difficulties that everyone's experiencing because of the recession, the worldwide recession. But also we are experiencing the kind of twin challenges of, if you like, of piracy on the one hand, which comes from technological change, and also all of the opportunities that technological change offers as well, in terms of being able to get our product to audiences more efficiently, and also in terms of how much more cheaply it is for people to make things, and also for people who aren't traditionally part of the industry to come into the industry and make things. The user-generated content, as it's so called. We have complex, I guess you call them HR issues in traditional business, but what I mean is that the cliche of the actor who won't get out of the caravan is unfortunately absolutely true, and the cliche of the screaming director who absolutely refuses to cut their 3-hour film is unfortunately true. So an awful lot of what we spend our time doing is kind of managing, you know, people who are very what's the word, trenchant in their ideas, who are very passionate about what they do, and in a way, as I said earlier, in response to John Carney's point, treading the line between the commercial and the artistic, if you like, and that's sort of part of our job, is to broker that line. On the one hand, we're responsible to the people who put money into our films in order to give them back something that they think they bought, and on the other hand, we have to try and encourage the creative talent that we work with to make something that actually fulfills the desire of our financiers. And the other thing that is a big sort of tension for us is that we now run a business, as I said earlier, we employ kind of, you know, about 17 people between here and the UK, but also obviously we, on a project by project basis, very much like a building, we gear up. So if we make a film, we'll employ 100 people for 3 months, and then, you know, they're all on a freelance contract. But we sort of didn't necessarily get into the business to run a business. We got into the business because we love making films. We were passionate about making films, and that's what we wanted to do. And you suddenly find yourself in a kind of a strange place where actually what you're really interested in is making films and getting them out there. But also you have to sort of be a proper business person in terms of managing your company and dealing with the normal kind of issues of HR and marketing and finance and all that kind of stuff. And I sometimes think that actually we haven't had the kind of sort of traditional business sort of education that you know you might get in, as I said, more traditional business, obviously. But you know that you kind of find yourself managing something without necessarily having a lot of training. So it's a lot of learning on the hoof. But anyway, they're just sort of some observations about our kind of day-to-day, which I think sort of chime with some of the things that have been said. I think I'm sort of about to run out of time, so I'm not going to bore on about the benefits of the Irish film industry, although I do think they are many and significant. And I think it's sort of fair to say that, I mean, the industry has only really been in its current incarnation around since 1993 when the Film Board was re-established. When I say the industry, I mean the kind of indigenous industry where you have Irish companies making things for the local and international market. But at last count, which was in 2008, the industry, the content production industry in Ireland was worth over €500 million and employed almost 7,000 people. So it's not huge, but it's quite significant. And there is a big push to try and make that more significant, to double the size of the industry over the next short while. But I do think one thing that is worth remembering, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about Farmley, we were all delighted, of course, to hear that, you know, the cultural industries are the saviour of Ireland and all that kind of stuff. But I also think we have to be very careful not to believe our own hype. And you know, and when you hear that, well, we are a nation of storytellers, we are fantastic, we're very creative, we're wonderful, all that kind of stuff, it's sort of, what I sometimes find in my day-to-day is that there is often a kind of a complacency that comes with that, and a kind of a big fish in a small pond syndrome. It's kind of like, well, I'm big in Ireland, and Ireland's great, so therefore I'm great. You know, so it's kind of, and you have to be very careful about that, because certainly in the part of the industry that I work, in the part of the sort of arts, culture, whatever it is that I work in, it's very much dependent on raising money from abroad and selling what we make abroad. And so I find that a lot of the time you have to kind of encourage people, and I think it's a challenge as we go forward, encourage people who are the kind of the writers and directors to really to see themselves not as competing within the Irish context, but competing within an international context. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be doing things that are Irish. It just means that they should understand that what they do has to be absolutely brilliant and ambitious, and they've got to work their arses off, because it's very, very difficult out there. And so it's not making a judgment on the kind of thing we're making, it's just the approach to what we make. I think that's it, actually. Anyway, thank you.
Can I invite you to come up? Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Ed. We've had some fantastic inspirational talks now, and we had a very energetic discussion before the break. we need to pick up that energy now. I know you've been sitting with the comments that you wanted to make, and there wasn't room for the comments. So now you have your chance. We've got about 12 minutes, so be quick, to the point, and the challenge is really on you. Yep.
In the view of the panel, do you think that we've happened upon culture as our way out of our current predicament, or do you think it is genuinely the basis for, recovery, I'm talking about in a broader sense, economic, social, and cultural? Like, is it there's nothing else? Or is it
Sorry, we
genuine?
didn't hear the question, so you don't know.
The question was, have we happened upon culture as the way out of our current predicament, or is it genuinely the best option available to us?
Do you have confidence in yourselves to provide?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one of the ways out. That's all. I mean, in this time, we're searching for new things, and we can't delude ourselves that this is going to solve the problem. But it's one of the ways. We have to improve our retail business. We have to improve all aspects of our business. But culture should be part of that, and especially as the more advanced we become, the recognition of innovation and creativity. But we must be realistic about it. As Ed said, you're competing out there. You have to know how we're going to compete, and what's unique or different about us.
It's very clear though, isn't it? Sorry, just to intervene at this point in relation to what you just said, and in the way that you're even answering the question, is that the crisis that we're in is not simply to do with international markets. It's to do with that there is a phenomenal economic crisis within Ireland, but then there is also a crisis with the Catholic Church, with the whole with those two reports and the kind of daily devastating reports that are coming out about the Catholic Church, where you have an economics and a Catholicism which has been underpinning the nation state, which and we're looking to the arts for some kind of response in a way, not just to an economics where we can get back into these international markets. Are we not also looking to the arts for something else? On what is that something else that you think that the arts, are integral to?
Yeah, well, that's why I started with our identity and social cohesion. And I think the arts has a role to play there. I mean, who are we as a nation, and what are we trying to do in a social sense? But I don't know whether I expressed that properly, but you're right though. It's much more than economic.
I'd like to venture, it's dangerous for me because I'm not from here, but then I'll answer as someone not from here, because when I started in business, I knew nothing at all about business, and it was very, very difficult for me to get any kind of advice. And one piece of advice that I got stuck out, and somebody said to me, here are two questions you need to answer if you want to set up a business. What are you good at, and does anyone want it? And so one of the things I'd say to you, maybe I don't know if it's Ed's caricature of everyone thinking that you're great at this, but I've been coming to Ireland for years teaching. I do some teaching at UCC as well, and I've been coming here for a while. The answer to the question, what are you good at, I think does include something about the humanities and the arts. You've got a lot of people who are really, really good at this sort of stuff. And if you take the question away from, I suppose, concerns that you have internally for a second and just ask yourselves the question, how would you kind of compete out there in the world? You are really, really good at this stuff, and I think there's a really great need for it. I think the kind of great need there is for it is a bit oblique, if you like. So I rather like your arguments about saying, talking about BMW example, or your example of the Swedish engineering firm. It's sometimes the oblique contribution that the arts make that will be the most powerful. Very, very hard to prove. I believe in that passionately, and I think there are lots of people who believe in that passionately. If that's the case, and we also know that in order to make that happen, we have to have a strong laboratory, as you put it, and we've got to have a proper a proper set of sources of scholarship, but also a proper set of places where people can be free to be creative without having to worry about market forces the whole time, I think that's a really good thing to invest in, because you're really good at this stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that I think over the last 10 years or so, we've just had a huge obsession with material wealth, and we have measured ourselves against our economic progress. And when that all disappeared, I think we found ourselves in a situation where, well, that's gone, so what have we left? And I think the real opportunity here with the arts and the cultural sector at large is that perhaps we can begin to reframe the discussion around our values and how we measure progress beyond simple economic indicators, but looking at things like quality of life, citizenship, community. And I think that is, going back to the points that John made, the sense of social cohesion perhaps is where the arts can be most powerful.
I suppose I better say something as well. I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the challenges in the film industry that we faced was that actually we had huge wage inflation during the good times, and that made Ireland very expensive to come and film in, as you know, as right across other industries. So it's not that I would wish that people get paid less than they could possibly be paid, but I do think that part of what's happening in the current climate is that actually people are kind of getting a bit more real about what they want, what they feel they're worth in terms of their earnings, but also they're kind of getting a bit more real about what they want to do and kind of remembering why they got into things in the first place and why they're doing what they're doing. And it is a cliche, but sometimes out of tough times comes the best work and the most interesting work. I mean, I know there's the bag of money suggestion that John made, but equally I think Temple Bar being case in point, that was that grew out of people basically squatting in cheap properties that were owned by the CIE, I think, at that stage, and there were cool bars around, and something grew out of that. So I'm optimistic that we might sort of get back to our roots, and we might sort of start thinking about why we want to do things and do them more for the right reason rather than for money. So I think that will only be a good thing.
Thank you.
My name is Susan Lindsay, and I'm visiting here today from Galway. I'm formerly a social science graduate, now interested in poetry, working in the field of psychology. I had kind of given up on the question and statement I wanted to make until I heard the latter part of the discussion. Because I think the critical thing about, and what delighted me when we came to think about focusing on ourselves as an art and culture branded country, if you like, was that I think internationally, globally, there is a desperate need for ways of being able to imagine ourselves into the future, and that we are going to be living in a very uncertain kind of world. You spoke about, when we talked about Temple Bar, the kind of uncertainties and the kind of frequent changes that are going to be happening in the world that we're living in. I think we've seen it economically, we've seen it rapidly. And we need ways to be doing that. And I think if we get caught up, though, in the brand and believe our own PR, as people were saying, that we have a great cultural identity, I don't think that is what we are about. I think we are seen that way, and therefore we ought to develop on that. But that we have to bring something in terms of offering people ways of thinking about the world, metaphors, images, narrative, the kind of thing that we are rich with. But if we're not bringing people opportunities to develop that and to find ways of doing that themselves. For example, I think it's absolutely crazy that as a tourist, because I looked this up on the web myself, if you look up on the web how you could come to Ireland to go to courses in creative writing, there's no cohesive. We have festivals throughout nearly every weekend in this country, but you can't cohesively find that if you look at that as a tourist on the web. You might find out if you're going to Donegal that there happens to be a poetry festival on or something festival on. I just want to make that point. I think that it's a much deeper thing that we need to be responding to, which is how are we globally and nationally going to make meaning of our lives and help people to reimagine the kind of society we're living in regularly.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, Professor, you framed it for me very well, coming from as an operator. You framed the discussion in terms of tourism and arts very, very well. And I think that in relation to, the number one activity that people do here when they come here is heritage. That's the number one thing. It's not golf, it's not hill walking, it's not any of those things. It's actually heritage. And if you look up the Tourism Ireland numbers, for the last whatever number of years they're producing those reports, that's the number one activity. And I think what I'm frustrated at in terms of what the government policy has been around this, and I think this is where there should be a new discourse, is that there should be more money put into heritage. There should be more money put into the likes of genealogy, and all the 9/11 census is one of the most fantastic things that will produce results in the future. And I think that, the government needs to focus in on, I just look at the long run photo there, and it really is, that connects. If you're abroad, that connects. And there are certain images of Ireland that connect to people. And that's one, you mentioned the Smithsonian, but that there in itself says an awful lot about Ireland, and it says an awful lot about Dublin. And I think that we get lost in the discussion here sometimes when you have to narrow it down into what we are about. We're about a lot of great things, but ultimately people view us in the outside world. They do see us as a sort of rich in culture, rich in heritage. They do go back in time, they do look at it. So I think that we need to connect more into that as an image and projecting that out into the wider world, because that gets us the footfall. And really, if we get the footfall into the country, then lots of other things will spread out. So.
Thank you. Catherine.
Catherine Gilmore from Trinity College. I just wanted to go back to something that Laura spoke about earlier about research for research's sake, and something obviously that I'm working in Trinity College here, so we hold dear as a principal. But I wanted to kind of draw attention to, in the same vein, communication for communication's sake, in terms of creative practitioners. And I applaud the Long Room Hub for organising this today. I think you've got a really good mixture of people who are analysing the situation, facilitating the situation, and are creative practitioners. And I think I just wanted to draw people's attention to something that I think is on the rise really in Dublin at the moment, is this communication with each other, practitioners communicating with each other for the sake of it. There may be underlying aims and objectives in terms of networking, in terms of inspiring each other, and collaborative projects that might come out of it, but there are certain events that have happened even just last night in terms of the Trinity Week. Ignite is a kind of a version of Pecha Kucha Night, which is something everybody should look up on YouTube or Google it. It's a way of getting people together who are interested in the arts, let's say as a general term, artists, designers, architects, and the discussions last night were scientists, business people, artists who come together and for 5 minutes chat about their own practice. And I think that's really interesting for us to, we've got our panel discussions, which are great, and what we need to do is reverse it and say, let's listen to the practitioners as well, go down to the particular as well as the general discussions. We've got these salons that happen, artists coming together in La Cathedral Studios in Dublin. It's a really dynamic, energetic time at the moment in Dublin, and I think it's maybe we need to allow ourselves to be free to communicate ideas, and possibly within that we might find a kind of patterns and methods of using that energy for economic recovery. But just to sit back and listen for a while. If you could see these Pecha Kucha nights that happen, they're all around the world, but in Dublin they happen in a place about this kind of size, packed to the gills with people of my generation, younger generation. It's not based around alcohol. There is alcohol present, but it's not the main. It's not. And I'm sorry that people have talked about Temple Bar in relation to alcohol. It is a jaded idea. But if you could have harnessed the energy in any of these situations, you would realise that there's so many people who are willing to come together to communicate. We need, what I was going to say was, if we could have more spaces for this, in terms of perception of the arts and physically. And I think Trinity College will probably become one of these spaces that will accommodate discussions for discussion's sake, which I think is just an important thing to highlight.
Thank you. And the last two comments, and then we need to draw it to a close.
Just to make two interesting points. The first being the guy whose company runs Ignite is O'Reilly Media, and he's an Irishman in California. So it goes back to the whole ability or that great sense of the Irish all over the world doing such, or involved so much in that innovation. And the second part is, again, you know, while we can identify with ourselves as being really leaders in terms of culture and our heritage, but we're also amazing at relating to each other and in terms of turning towards each other, which is what the world needs right now. That's one of our great strengths as a country. So I think if we marry the two, that's one of the that's where we can really create leadership and bring leadership into the fore.
Thanks. And the last is Joanna Archbold, who is the author of the Creativity City and University report, which was launched just a couple of days ago and which John drew attention to. Joanna.
Thanks, Paul. Obviously, I have a lot to say, but I think just maybe follow up on what the speaker was saying here about the National Archives and the 1911 census. What happened there, as far as I understand, is that the National Archives, in partnership with the National Library and Archives in Canada, got together to do this digitisation project using their expertise, and then they have worked with Tourism Ireland to use this genealogy resource as a way to bring people into Ireland, as John said, virtually, but it's also much more of a physical thing as well. And I think that shows very innovative thinking in terms of the very basic functions of arts and humanities, which is finding these resources, working with technology to bring them into art, to kind of to allow people to interpret them and to help people to interpret them, and then to get the right stakeholders in place with someone like Tourism Ireland. And that's very innovative thinking. Even though technology is involved, innovation doesn't have to include technology. And I think the professional staff in the institutions working with the right stakeholders and supported on a national level, I think it can be extremely important.
Thank you. I think we should remember that people under extreme duress, people who are kept hostage for years, tell us when they are released that although they were living at the very bottom of Maslow's pyramid of needs, the way in which they survived was not that they had shelter, because sometimes they didn't, that they had food, they had often too little, some drink, but too little. But what kept them going was stories. The fact that they were able to communicate with each other. And even when they were deprived of human contact, they needed to express themselves. They needed to invent little tools that made it possible for them to draw little drawings, play little games, all which goes into what makes arts and humanities. It's really human creativity, human imagination that keeps us alive. Therefore, I have no doubt that the arts and humanities are the key to survival of Ireland and of the world, of humanity. If we forget that, if we turn everything into just a question of profitability, of course we would have lost sight of what makes us human. So I think on that note, I would like to thank the panel for...
Just say one last thing.
All right.
I don't want people to go home depressed. I have to, I'm speaking as an economist now. There's always swings. You know, when the times are good, people get carried away. We're getting carried away in the opposite direction now. You know, we are going to pull out of this. There's lots of the fundamentals of the economy have not changed. We have a collapse in the banking system. We have a world recession. But don't forget, we produce some of the best food in the world. We have some of the best IT sectors in the world. We have some very good pharmaceutical industries. We have the creative industries. And as a graduate, I used to teach him earlier. You know, again, a big success story. The arts are part of that. But the prospect for the Irish economy, to leave you on a happy note, are good. It'll take a time, but there is no reason in the world why we can't get back in the lead position.
Thank you, John. And we have had a wonderful panel. We have had representatives note of 3 businesses in the private sector. Forget about the nonsense that the arts and humanities are not commercial. Of course we are. We are in the private sector. But the distinctive point about the arts and humanities is that we don't get up in the morning to turn a profit. We are actually driven by an interest in what makes us human. And that's really the distinctive quality that's come out very well in all the 4 panelists' contribution today. And we had a wonderful, engaging discussion today. So I want to thank you all, but so let us congratulate each other.